Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to talk more about the goals and achievements of the progressive movement. And I'm going to begin with the most obvious one perhaps, which is that of women's suffrage. And we find that in the period from 1880 to 1910, the number of women in the workplace had tripled from 2.5 million to almost 8 million. And as women move into the workplace, there's a growing expectation that women should be involved in other aspects of public life, in particular, the right to vote. What is interesting and perhaps counterintuitive is that the right to vote for women, beginning at the state level, begins in Western states. It begins, first of all, in the state of Wyoming. Bank that one away for a trivia question sometime. But there's a sense that in these Western states that are less established, that women have to perform more independent roles, especially if their homesteader husband dies, and so that these Western states are more initially ready to entrust women with the vote. And so it takes until 1912 for an East Coast state, a state east of the Mississippi even, the state of New York, to approve the women's right to vote. This movement that encouraged the women's right to vote was not without its own biases that reflect the concerns of the time. There is an idea that we see prevalent in some of the writings of those who are advocating for women's right to vote, that women are in some way, by virtue of their sex, more virtuous than men are, and that therefore they should be allowed to vote. There's also a racial bias, that women, and a class bias, that white women feel that they should have received the right to vote before African Americans, that educated women feel that they should have received the right to vote before uneducated men, both black and white. And so the movement for women's suffrage has its own biases as well as its own cause. Another goal of the progressive era, another goal that's very successful, is the issue of direct democracy. You remember that I said that one great driver of the progressive era is industrialization and large corporations, and the other is political corruption, sort of patronage system that we talked about last week. And so there's a growing pressure on states and on the federal government to make ordinary citizens, or to give ordinary citizens, more access to voting and more access to choosing their national government. This is something, if you remember, that the founding fathers had resisted up to a point. They saw this as potentially dangerous and chaotic, and this was why they restricted the involvement of people in the federal government to one branch, Congress, of the legislative branch, one branch of one branch. But as we move late into the 19th century, political corruption becomes rife. Of course, political corruption is tied to the rise of big businesses who now increasingly control politics. And there's a move to there's an understanding that it's better to have the chaos that the founding fathers feared with more of a democratic influence than it is to have the type of suffocating corruption that seems to be happening now, where a small number of businesses control the political system and control it in a corrupt way. And so, first of all, we see the development of primaries, that citizens will vote in who their party nominates, rather than party bosses, wealthy donors choosing who the party nominates. In 1898, and so this system of primaries begins in South Carolina. In 1898, South Dakota becomes the first state to establish what's called initiative and referendum. That an initiative can be proposed, can be put on the ballot, and then can be voted on by people without having to go through the legislature. So the whole trust and confidence that the legislature can maintain and implement the will of the people is kind of being called into question by this act. We also see the development of recalls, that those who have been elected to public office can be thrown out of public office by the voters if they seem to be overreaching or forgetting why they have been elected to public office. So these are all ways of trying to make American politics more accountable to the electorate at the state level. We also see this at the federal level, most significantly with the passing of the 17th Amendment in 1913. And the 17th Amendment established that from now on, senators previously elected by their state legislatures would now be elected by citizens voting, the system that we have today. Previously, it would be that people voted for their state legislature, and the state legislature would vote for the senators. And now this is seen as too closed of a system, and that it needs to be opened up, and ordinary voters need to have more access to this system. And so you can see how there's this drive for direct democracy. But this is happening at a state and at a federal level. At the same time, the progressive era is actually hollowing out democracy at the local level. And this is a legacy of the progressive movement's confidence in science and confidence in experts. And so we start to see the growth of a governing class that begins at the local level. There's an understanding that politics is becoming too complicated for electing just anyone to office. And so that those who have to be elected have to be experts. If they're not, they have to be helped by experts to craft their policy and to govern. And so we start to see models on the local level like the commission model, that you have a commissioner who does the governing, he carries out the agenda of local representatives who have been elected. But the representatives themselves don't do so. You see the creation of a non-partisan bureaucracy at the state level. And there's an understanding that you need, if you're taking on these big corporations that are kind of a law unto themselves, you need to have a big corporation to fight that battle. But it's also the case that, as you can imagine, people are becoming more and more removed from local politics. And so involvement in local politics, in local elections, that is on the decline, at the same time as you have a growing influence in politics on a national level. So that's political reform. We also see social reform. Social reform in the prohibition movement. Efforts to restrict and abolish the sale and public consumption of alcohol that are successful with the passage of the 18th Amendment in 1917. And also with efforts to reform labor, to reduce working hours and to reduce the number of children who are working. And this effort received some success in the Supreme Court decision of Muller versus Oregon, which limits the number of hours that women can work to 10 hours a day. Still a really long day. It gives you a sense of the type of labor conditions that the progressives are trying to reform, and it shows that there's a certain amount of success that's being achieved. So these are the main programs of the progressive movement. Women's suffrage, more direct democracy, and then social reforms of labor, and those include efforts to prohibit the consumption of alcohol.